Um, Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Um, we welcome you to this panel discussion on a Sunday afternoon. So today, June 20th marks the World Refugee Day. And as per the UNHCR statistics, there are almost 82.4 million people who are forcibly evicted from their home all around the world, and almost 26.4 million of them are refugees. And Sri Lanka, having been a conflict-driven country, has produced almost 1 million refugees since the post-independence. But the situation of refugees who are coming to our homes has been problematic, and we have been living in a dilemma all throughout. So while we were discussing within hashtag, we thought it is important to shed light on this issue that gets often overlooked or ignored. So today we are bringing this panel discussion with you, understanding refugee crisis from the local perspectives. We are joined by panelists who in their own fair share have done a lot of work around this issue they care about. We have Mayuran Anthony Jeevaratnam, we have Rocky Fernando, and we have Swastika Arulingam, who will be joining us to share their experiences and also to educate us about the ongoing refugee crisis. And firstly, let me invite, we'll be hearing from all the panelists. Then following the panelist speeches, we'll be taking the questions from the audience as well. So right throughout the panel discussion, please feel free to share your comments. Please feel free to share your questions with us, and we'll be taking those questions with the panelists. And we are really looking forward to having an informed and engaging discussion right throughout today. So our first panelist today will be Mayuran Anthony Jeevaratnam. And he is a Sri Lankan, but he has lived in exile in India as a refugee for 25 years. And during his time living as a refugee in India, he has finished his bachelor's in chemistry, master's in social work, and his master in philosophy and social work in India. And also he has made submissions concerning to the refugees in UNHRC convention in Geneva in 2016. And also he has participated as an honorary attendant of the UNHRC convention in Geneva in 2018. So Mayuran, the virtual flow is over to you.
Thank you, Benny, for the good for the introduction, and thank you for everyone for giving me this opportunity to be part of this panel discussion. My name is Mayuran. I'm based in Point Pedro in Jaffna district. I'm privileged to be part of this live discussion on understanding the refugee crisis, and I take this opportunity to thank everyone just for considering me as a speaker in this panel. Before going to my speech, let me want to ask few questions for the audience, just for reflection. According to you, what is a World Refugee Day? Why is it commemorated every year? How is it significantly related to you, the Sri Lankans? Just please think it over and find the answers for these questions by yourself. For me, when I reflect on these questions, I got the following. I dream a world or a place without any refugees. Having gone through the life as a refugee in India, I know it's a journey of agony, despair, and pain to be a refugee, and hence I feel no one should live a life of a refugee. Particularly, I want to say something in Tamil. என் நாட்டவரும் என் நாட்டிலும் அகதியாக வாழக்கூடாது. குறிப்பாக என் நாட்டவர் என் நாட்டிலும் அகதியாக வாழக்கூடாது. translate the same in English, any people shouldn't live as refugee in any part of the world, particularly my own country people, Sri Lankans, shouldn't live as refugee in any part of the world. To brief about my past, the uncertainties caused by the civil war in the country forced my family to flee the country in 1990 and seek asylum in India. We were very happy to overcome the dangerous sea journey and like very happy to reach the shores of Tamil Nadu without no hopes in our mind. When we step in, we don't know how the future is going to be. And just to translate our journey as a refugee fleeing our own country is by bidding farewell to our land of life, our homeland Sri Lanka, we buried our smiles in our lips, we buried our life in our bodies, and we made a procession like empty skeletons. This was the way I felt, and I do feel that this was the way not only the Sri Lankans who left the country feel, but also people in different parts of the world feel when they leave their homeland out of fear of persecution. For me, after living a life as a refugee in exile, it took me 25 years to get back to my country. The story of a refugee life in a refugee camp, being stripped of fundamental rights, is one of trauma, pain, agony, and despair. And it shouldn't. I don't expect anyone to have the same, which I've gone through, which many people are going through as refugees in other countries. Nevertheless, I've been able to take control of my uncertain future with the support of the host government and also my own community, and I've become a successful refugee and also returnee, and now a resourceful individual who can contribute back to the refugee return and reintegration of the refugees coming back to Sri Lanka. And I feel that my journey is a positive story for refugees all around the world aspiring for a good future. That confidently I can say that. Understanding the importance of ensuring safe and dignified reintegration of refugee returnees coming to Sri Lanka who have been displaced outside the country for nearly 3 decades. Currently, I am associated with the humanitarian interventions as a community social worker. Yeah, that's the past about me and what I do for the refugee returnees. But to introduce about the refugee context in which our country is involved, of course, everyone is aware of the context. The uncertainties caused by the civil war forced about 1 million Sri Lankans to leave the country and seek refuge in India and other countries. And yeah, we are proud to say, but again, it's sad to say that we have successfully produced 1 million Sri Lankans as refugees to different continents. But again, we are not ready to accept even a single refugee who is coming from outside into our country. And when we think of this 1 million number of people, about 1/3 who are the most vulnerable as they were unable to afford travel to European countries, sought asylum in India by boats. But again, the Tamil Sri Lankan refugees in India have lived in the camp since 1983 with the welfare assistance of the government of Tamil Nadu and government of India. Of course, everyone knows that though India is not a signatory to the UN Convention on Refugees, Sri Lankan refugees in India have been assisted with the kind of administrative circulars and ad hoc procedures that were set out by the state and central government. In my life, in the determination to take control of an uncertain future, we have, I would say I have always prioritized the education, and particularly my community in India, they have always prioritized finding durable solutions to put an end to their protracted refugee situation. And when it comes to the durable solutions for refugees, there are 3 options available. One is coming back to the country, and second one is local integration, and third one is going for the third country resettlement. But for our people, the option what they have is, you might know, everyone know, when we say the option, the third country resettlement for our people is not possible because they don't have the documents to go for it, and local reintegration is not possible because of the fact that Indian government has stringent measures to provide citizenship or observe them in different and provide them different resident status. Therefore, our people, Sri Lankans in India, recognize returning to their homeland as the best durable solution. So, ever since the war ended in Sri Lanka in 2009, our people have been contemplating to return to Sri Lanka to restart their lives in their own land with fullest freedom and rights. The reason is that the uncertainties of camp life are difficult to navigate and survive. We have spent a generation of people, maybe a second or third generation starts to live in a camp, that too in a pack living setup. The agony and despair of that camp life is, it can't be expressed through words. So they want to come back and resettle in their place of origin with fullest rights. And when it comes to the situation back in the country, now more than 12 years have passed since the war had ended. And since then, over 18,000 refugees have returned to their homeland, Sri Lanka, and have been able to restart their lives. Whereas the vast majority, around 100,000 people, still remain in the camps and outside with wide range of concerns. As you are aware that, all these Sri Lankans who are coming back to their country mostly return with no resources or limited resources in their hands. They face multiple challenges at the time of return. And we need to understand the fact that, there are events in history that bring about extraordinary changes for the better. One such historical and memorable event for the Sri Lankans in India concerned would be the return to their homeland. This is due to the fact that, as I've said, they have the only option available to end their protracted refugee situation, which is just coming back to their country. And for them, the voluntary repatriation has long been seen as the foremost durable solution to forced displacement and the solution that would benefit them in greatest numbers. Such an event will go a long way in strengthening the process of peace building and reconciliation in Sri Lanka. While there is more to be done in the direction of reconciliation and reintegration, I believe that encouraging the refugees to return will further strengthen the process of peace building, reconciliation, and reintegration in the country. And when it comes to the return and reintegration of refugees from India, everyone must be aware of the fact that, UNHCR is doing great work with facilitating the refugees from India coming back to Sri Lanka and to restart their lives in their place of origin. But again, you all know that, only the support, UNHCR's AFS support, and then small minimum resettlement grant is not enough for them to restart their life, because they have spent 2 to 3 decades of their life as refugees in an alien land, and they are coming back to their homeland without experiencing the color of the land for 20 to 30 years. And they need more than that of support to be given for them to restart their life as a fullest manner of reintegration in their place of origin. Because the return itself, when you think of return, the return itself is again a kind of uprooting, and therefore the process should be resourced. Because just I want to give an example of a tree that's growing in a different place. If for 25 years, if you're going to uproot the tree and if you want to replant the tree in a different place, the tree has to be resourced. Otherwise, the tree can't grow further. Similarly, I feel that the refugees should be placed in an extraordinary situation, conditions, and they should be provided extraordinary support to restart their lives back in their place of origin. And when it comes to the support for the refugees for resettlement and reintegration, the government of Sri Lanka endorses an open policy to welcome the refugee returnees from India and other countries, and it provides rehabilitation assistance with land, housing, livelihood, and basic subsistence for refugee returnees. However, of course, everyone knows that there are key gaps in the support services that recognize them as legal citizens of the country with documentation. I'm sorry. The persons in the refugee camps are burdened with the penalties and late registration charges that multiplies the vulnerability of displacement. I can give you an example. If a person, refugee, failed to get his citizenship from the Sri Lankan Deputy High Commission in Chennai, if he or she comes back, they have to pay a huge amount of penalty for getting their citizenship done. So, they have been away from the country, they have lost their documents in the course of displacement from place to place. Submit their supportive documents to close certificates. They are coming back to the country, and again, they have to face the burden of paying the late registration penalty or citizenship penalty, which is the lack of resources with the government of Sri Lanka, particularly particularly for the provision of reintegration benefits to refugees. And the absence of national policy on refugee returnees have been a major hurdle in extending the holistic support for the refugee returnees. Hence, I would say the vast majority face multiple challenges to reintegrate themselves back in their place of origin, and that acts as a deciding factor throughout the hopes of more than 100,000 refugees living in India with the hopes to come back and resettle in their place of origin. And when we think of facilitating the return and reintegration of Sri Lankan refugees, everyone should understand one historical fact. I would want you all to know the Srimava Sastri Pact and the Srimava Indira Pact, and many of you know that uh, by which circumstances these pacts have been made. The Britishers have brought South Indians from Tamil Nadu and Kerala and other places for making tea plantations in Sri Lanka. And those South Indians, particularly Tamils, Indian origin Tamils, they have toiled hard to make smiling plantations in Sri Lanka. But again, soon after the independence of our country, the ruling government disenfranchised them. The citizenship of those people have been snatched away by the then ruling government, and therefore they were forced to live for 2 decades as stateless people in Sri Lanka, where they had been living as citizens. And then, like in order to make a decision on their future, the government of India and Sri Lanka came together for Srimava Sastri Pact and Srimava Indira Pact, and based on that they were repatriated back to India. And that's the history. And why I bring that repatriation here is, when we think of repatriating the Sri Lankan refugees from India back to Sri Lanka, the governments of India and Sri Lanka don't need to reinvent the wheel. There is a history where the governments have joined and they have jointly facilitated the repatriation of Indians back in their country from Sri Lanka. And similarly, same kind of process could be initiated to support the return and reintegration of Sri Lankan refugees from India to Sri Lanka. And you would know that, because when you think of return and reintegration of refugees from one country to the home country back, there has not been much the most success stories around the world. However, this repatriation of Indians from Sri Lanka to India has been to some extent a great success, because it was very well planned as per the reports. Because the Indians who were repatriated from Sri Lanka were provided land, housing, employment, and job opportunities at the entry point of Tamil Nadu. That's in Mandapam refugee camp. Similar program could be replanned to facilitate the return and reintegration of Sri Lankan refugees from India to Sri Lanka. And particularly when we think of that program, it should be a structured refugee return program. It should underline the concerns and fear of refugees who had lived away from the country for more than 2 to 3 decades. And particularly, the refugees in India have accumulated their livelihood assets and other assets in their course of refugee life. And the governments of India and Sri Lanka should come together to make an arrangement to transport those materials back to Sri Lanka through ferry service. Because for that, the ferry service to be started, that should be the initial part of the structured refugee return program. And for the Sri Lankan refugees languishing in the camps in India, a greater political action is required now to facilitate them to bring back to a country. And for that, the governments of India and Sri Lanka can come together, because there has been, as part of Indo-Sri Lankan ties, there has been several discussions taking place. But again, this has been considered considered with minimal attention. Just what I feel is, we shouldn't let, as I said during my introduction, our people should not live in another country as refugees, should not live in alien land as refugees without rights and freedom. Therefore, we should not let and see. We should not have the wait and watch attitude. We should urge the government of Sri Lanka and government of India to come together and plan an action in the form of structured refugee return to bring back those people. So therefore, it's my plea that the discussion among the governments of India and Sri Lanka should progress and eventually lead to a memorandum of understanding to develop a structured return program which could address all the concerns and fears of refugees, and in a way in which the refugees should be treated by being placed in extraordinary circumstances, and they should be provided extraordinary support to restart their lives in their place of origin. And in this line, I respectfully request that provisions ensuring the inalienable right of refugees to return to our home country and guaranteeing a life in safety and dignity should be enshrined. And for that, UNHCR and the international community should come together and should support the government of India and Sri Lanka. To reiterate what I said in the beginning, I dream a world without refugees. I dream a world without refugees. I dream that my country people, Sri Lankans, shouldn't live anywhere as refugees without rights. And we should emphasize the fact, no longer a refugee. Particularly, just to say in Tamil, என் நாட்டவர் என் நாட்டிலும் அகதியாக வாழக்கூடாது, அதே போன்று என் நாட்டவரும் என் நாட்டிலும் அகதியாக வாழக்கூடாது. Like any country people shouldn't live anywhere as refugees, and let's all come together and act together to put an end to the refugee crisis. In addition, just before I conclude my speech, I want to make a plea to the government of Sri Lanka here through this forum, that our country has produced more than 1 million refugees from Sri Lanka, and other countries like India and other countries, they were kind enough to observe our people into their nation, and they provided citizenship, resident status, and other measures. Except except in still countries, there are people, our people still living as refugees, but those are very limited numbers when you take with the whole lot of numbers. So considering the fact that we have produced 1 million refugees, and therefore we have the obligation to support very minimal number of refugees who are knocking the doors of our country to provide asylum here. We should be kind enough to those hundreds of people who reach us and seeks asylum in our country out of fear of persecution. And with that, I want to say that we should emphasize that no longer a refugee, no longer a refugee. With that, I want to conclude, and thank you for the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayuran. Thank you for sharing your experiences, and also thank you for educating us on this key issue. Next, let me welcome Ruki Fernando to take the virtual floor. Ruki has been involved in refugee rights activism, in supporting refugee families coming to Sri Lanka, engaging in advocacy, mobilizing volunteers, facilitating legal assistance and representation, making presentation to students and about refugees, and also engaging with media, educating people, writing and giving interviews as well. And also, Ruki has also been working with some Sri Lankans who have left Sri Lanka as refugees. So let me welcome Ruki to present his ideas. Ruki, over to you.
Okay, thank you for inviting me, and I think also for organizing this event. This is actually the third event for today on World Refugee Day in Sri Lanka. So in the morning there was one with some refugees themselves who were the speakers, and then there was a kind of a talent show in the afternoon where they showcased their talents and skills, which was very inspiring. And so this is like the last event that we're joining. So that shows that there is some interest, and there's also active participation of refugees and asylum seekers who are coming to Sri Lanka in activities and matters that concern them. They are not just bystanders. So unlike Myron, I think I haven't been a refugee as such. So I think my experience will not be so personal. At most, I think for a few months I had to be in exile, and my experience was also quite positive because there were many people who welcomed me and supported me even for the few months. But I'm going to talk primarily about people who come from other countries to Sri Lanka, refugees in Sri Lanka. So the photo I show, the one at the bottom, is some of those people when they were redisplaced. So their first displacement was from their country to come to Sri Lanka. And even while they were here, they were suddenly redisplaced. And the other photo is some schoolgirls, some A-level students from a school in Colombo who were very supportive about refugees, and with a small group that I had worked with. So I will speak largely about Sri Lanka, but I will also, before that, give a little bit of indication about a global picture. And maybe in the discussion part, I will mention some ideas about how to help as such. So the global picture is that people get displaced from their homes, from villages, countries, due to development projects, natural disasters, discrimination, violence, war, and for a variety of reasons. In the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 14 says that everyone has a right to seek asylum and to enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution. So this is a right. Asylum is a right. And this is something that it is good to remember. There are IDPs, internally displaced people inside your own country. IDP, internally displaced person, displaced inside the own country. And then broadly, the word refugees is used for people who cross the boundary of a country, like what Myron had done, crossing from Sri Lanka to India. And even in that, there are two major categories. Refugees are those recognized as refugees by UNHCR or an individual country. There's a second category called asylum seekers, and these are refugee applications which are being examined by UNHCR or an individual country. So these are people who have been not recognized yet as refugees by UNHCR or a particular country. And then if that is rejected, there's also possibility of appeal. So there's an international convention on refugees, and that defines the term refugee and outlines the rights of refugees, as well as the legal obligations of the states to protect them. 149 state parties are a party to the Refugee Convention or the 1967 protocols. Sri Lanka is not a party. A major part of this Refugee Convention of our important principle is called non-refoulement, which basically says that when there's a well-founded fear of persecution, that no country should be returning people to their own country. So the term used is well-founded fear of persecution, which can be very broad. It can cover a lot of things. So in addition to the Refugee Convention, this is also prohibited under other international law. Another important institution that we talk a lot about is UNHCR, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. This was created in 1950 after the World War. Initially, it was only for 3 years, but then it extended and it is still there. So now has about 17,000 people working in 135 countries, including Sri Lanka. The budget in the first year was $300,000 US, and now it's massive. So it's in billions, 8.6 billion in 2019. They are, according to their website, they say that they have helped more than 50 million refugees to successfully restart their lives. So more recent figures, as of end of last year, 82.4 million people have been displaced. And out of these, the largest number, actually 48 million, is internally displaced within the country. In Sri Lanka too, particularly during the war, but even also during natural disasters, and sometimes due to development projects, people get internally displaced. In terms of refugees, there are 26.4 million, and asylum applications 4.1 million. So that's approximately 30 million. The countries where the most number of refugees come from as of last year was Syria, Venezuela, Afghanistan, South Sudan, and Myanmar. But this is more important for us, I think, in terms of hosting countries. And 86%, according to UNHCR's data, 86% of the refugees are hosted by developing countries. Now, there's often a myth that it is only developed countries or Western countries that host refugees. That is actually a big lie. That is wrong. No, 86%, according to UNHCR, are hosted in developing countries, and 73% are hosted in neighboring countries. And the countries that host the largest numbers are Turkey, Colombia, Pakistan, Uganda, and Germany. And Sri Lanka hosts a very, very small number, about 1,200. And what is unique to Sri Lanka is that Sri Lanka hosting is also temporary. No, it's not permanent. And this, if you think of the population of Sri Lanka, is really, really very, very tiny, 0.006 approximately. So coming to the Sri Lankan picture, this is the UNHCR office in Colombo 7. No, Colombo 7 is often used as in Sinhalese we say Colombo Hatariyanne. It is like the poshest area of Colombo. That is kind of the terminology that is used in Sinhalese. So this is in Colombo 7. This is one photo that has been published, taken outside UNHCR. Sri Lanka is not a party to the International Convention on Refugees or the 1967 protocols. And importantly, Sri Lanka has no national laws or mechanisms to offer support and protection to refugees. And we don't offer refugee status. We are only a transit country for refugees. That's all. And refugees have to abide by local laws, and they are liable for any legal action that may be taken for any criminal activities they may be suspected of. So very similar to Sri Lankan citizens. They are not above the law, but they are actually below the law because some of the constitutional rights that is offered to Sri Lankans is not offered to refugees. For example, a very important clause in our constitution, Article 12.2 on non-discrimination, they are not covered by that. Article 14.1 about freedom of expression, assembly, association, they are not entitled to that either. 14A, which is relatively new, right to information also, they are excluded. And there's also Article 13.7, a bit complicated one, which more or less tries to exclude them from protection offered from arbitrary arrest and detention. And this last one became very significant when me and a few others filed a case in 2014 against the deportation. And this was the clause that was used to throw out our case. But there is an agreement between Sri Lankan government and UNHCR, a formal kind of a policy agreement, a written agreement, which basically allows to facilitate the implementation of UNHCR's mandate in favor of refugees and asylum seekers who come to Sri Lanka, and also plus IDPs as well who are inside Sri Lanka. And the key feature of this is that the government will at all times grant UNHCR unimpeded access to refugees, asylum seekers, and IDPs. Now, this has been upheld by successive governments to a large extent in my experience, but there have been occasions, including in March this year, when this was violated and UNHCR was denied access to asylum seekers. So basically, UNHCR registers people who come here as asylum seekers, and they process their applications and decide whether they are refugees or not. And this terms of preference in 2006 between the government and UNHCR lays down the procedure. So this is the more like the policy framework. So in Sri Lanka as well, there are two categories, refugees and asylum seekers. As of 31st May, the numbers are 974 refugees and 224 asylum seekers whose refugee applications are pending at UNHCR. And there's also a very small number, probably less than 50, but no accurate numbers are available, of refugees who have a Canadian private sponsors in process, and also those who have Canadian private sponsors approved, but who have been unable to leave Sri Lanka. There are also a few who have been rejected by UNHCR and have no sponsors. And there are also some people who have come as refugees and married to Sri Lankans. But these are very small numbers. In terms of the number of countries that they come from, the largest number come from Pakistan. The next largest is Afghanistan. And then there's a mixture of mostly Asian and some Middle Eastern and a very few African countries as well, like Eritrea and Nigeria. So, but the largest number is from Pakistan, second largest from Afghanistan. Mostly it's Ahmadiyya Muslims, Muslim community who are rejected and persecuted in Pakistan in particular, legally not accepted as Muslims. And there's also a significant number of Christians who have been facing persecution. But there are other Muslims, Sunni Shia Muslims, there are ex-Muslims, there are gay persons, there are human rights activists, journalists, bloggers, lawyers, etc. also who had come. So UNHCR provides allowance only to refugees, not to asylum seekers, and that's about 10,000 rupees for a single person. For a couple with a child, 16,000, and couple with 2-3 children, 22,000, couple with 4 or more children, 30,000. And I think Sri Lankans will understand that this is not at all adequate for a decent, dignified living. And this is for everything. And this amount has not increased in the last, at least since 2015, as far as I know, this has been the same. So prices have skyrocketed, but the allowance has remained the same. UNHCR provides free education to refugee children in primary schools, but no education to children of asylum seekers or of refugees if they're about 12 or around that, or children of asylum seekers who have been rejected. There's free healthcare in government hospitals, but sometimes asylum seekers, refugees face hostilities when they go to these hospitals. And I have intervened in certain occasions where they had faced hostility. So I have encountered this hostility very personally, not for myself, but for asylum seekers and refugees. They're not allowed to work legally. And when they work illegally in desperation, sometimes they get exploited. And unlike Sri Lankan workers, they cannot complain because it's technically illegal for them to work. They get no housing facilities, although we see a lot of government buildings that have been abandoned and could be potentially used, or even personal buildings. And some house owners have been reluctant to rent, and some charge higher rents and don't repay the advances. There's government nutrition programs, so they're not entitled to these, and no education, and some kids don't go to school. Despite the free education policy that Sri Lanka claims pride in, it's not offered to a few hundred refugee and asylum seeker children, which is, I think, a great tragedy. But they rent houses and rooms from Sri Lankans benefit. Sri Lankan shops benefit because they buy stuff from Sri Lankan shops. They travel around in Sri Lankan three-wheelers, buses, gain income for Sri Lankans. They provide cheap labor to Sri Lankan employers, and they get financial support from overseas from their relatives and friends. So basically, as I see it, they contribute to the Sri Lankan economy. COVID-19 has made the situation more difficult for them. Resettlement to different countries stopped, except to the US. They live in tiny houses and they find it very difficult to do that during lockdown, particularly if they are forced to quarantine at home. It's very difficult to keep physical distance. Online education is difficult as parents don't have enough devices, smartphones or laptops or tabs. Some activities for refugees by NGOs had also been stopped. And difficult to join online activities as devices used by children being used for education. And they found it difficult to seek treatment for sicknesses, and particularly for pregnant and breastfeeding mothers. Even the informal jobs that they were doing, they couldn't continue because of the lockdowns and COVID-related situation. They couldn't receive money from overseas, people who were getting money. And then people who were actually supporting them from overseas and even within Sri Lanka also found it difficult because of the economic crisis related to COVID. And even those who never asked for food had started to ask for food in the last few weeks and months. And there's also uncertainty about decisions and resettlement. So they are generally very depressed. If you talk to them, they are very depressed. And when I talk to them, I also end up being very depressed because it's often very helpless or powerless situation. And there have been the need to provide daily counseling for some of them. And some of them have also started to return, risking their lives, hoping to go to another country from their own country, because they feel it's impossible to stay in Sri Lanka. There's simply not enough support. The last part that I would talk at this stage is about the Easter Sunday bombings and its aftermath. And I see this as a crisis and opportunity. About 2/3 of them, refugees, were evicted from their homes after the Easter bombings in April 2019. Some house owners were threatened by neighbors and mobs to evict them. And in some cases, the police had also suggested the owners to evict them. And some were kicked, beaten, pushed, and there were others who were threatened with physical violence. And efforts to relocate them to places offered by a church and NGO failed due to threats and protests by mobs. So it was a very hostile environment at that particular time. They ended up in houses of Sri Lankans who offered free temporary accommodation. A small number of Sri Lankans were very generous and welcomed them to their houses. But there were also camps, 2 camps in Pasyala and Nigambo by Ahmadiyya mosques. A small church in Colombo offered a small space for about 10-15. The Nigambo police station hosted about 150 of them for about a month. And then finally, there was a facility opened up in Vaunia by the government where several hundred went. So this is where they ended up after being evicted. So these are some photos I had taken at that time. You can see the conditions of the camps. The top photo is the initial stage. After about 2 months, the condition improved slightly. But I think that was also an opportunity because from my experience, there was increased institutional support after the Easter Sunday bombings to refugees and asylum seekers. There are a few individuals in the Sri Lankan Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Human Rights Commission, and in Sri Lankan NGOs and even international NGOs who had not worked and not been concerned with refugees became involved in a positive way. And even foreign governments like US and Canada listened to us when we appealed to them and expedited resettlement, and new countries offered resettlement. So in a way, there was more institutional support. But most importantly, I think there were a whole lot of Sri Lankans who came forward sympathetically and supportively. There were people, individuals and families who offered their houses free of charge, opened their doors. There were religious houses who offered their accommodation facilities free of charge. There were lots of people who contributed money for food, medicine, and other things. There were volunteers who helped in documentation. There were volunteers who accompanied some people to hospitals and other places, artists who helped in cultural activities, lawyers who took up cases, journalists from mainstream media, alternative media, also international media who wrote about refugees in a positive way and their struggles, difficulties, and also many students who started to become involved. These are examples of articles in mainstream newspapers with quite a prominent coverage, which I had never seen before. Before the 2019 Easter Sunday bombings and that crisis. And these are some girls from a school, some A-level girls who became involved and supportive towards refugees after that crisis. And there has been since then many other students, university students, who have also become interested and supportive. So I think I will stop here. We can discuss a little bit more maybe in terms of how to help later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ruki, for that enlightening presentation. And yeah, we are continuing to ask our audience to send in more questions you want to ask the panelists. Right after our next speaker, we'll open the floor for questions and we'll take your questions. Last but not the least, I welcome Swastika Arulingam to make a presentation. Swastika is a lawyer who has been working on legal cases pertaining to refugees. She has also worked as a project manager at the Legal Aid Commission of Sri Lanka for 3 years. Swastika, the virtual floor is open to you.
Hi all. So I just, in my presentation, I want to maybe amplify or echo some of the things which Ruki and Mayuran had said in their presentations, and also maybe explain things from my point of view of doing cases on behalf of refugees and so on. So as you recall, Ruki said about the difference between refugees and asylum seekers and how Sri Lanka does not have a policy of, and Mayuran also mentioned, Sri Lanka does not have a policy with regards to refugees. We don't have a policy of permanently hosting refugees and so on. So what happens is, I think many of us take it for granted that UNHCR is doing refugee resettlement, UNHCR is doing refugee status determination. And it's taken for granted that UNHCR is handling this. But actually the situation is much more complicated, as Mayuran and Ruki explained. So one of the things which we see is when a person comes into the country, he can come by way of legal means, he can come by way of illegal means. But when a person comes into the country, to Sri Lanka, if he or she wants to be accepted as a refugee, then they have to reach UNHCR and make an application. Soon after they make an application, they are given, after an interim process, they are given something called an asylum seeker certificate. And that is like a temporary protection for them to remain in Sri Lanka. But that is not a permanent protection, as I will explain later on. And this certificate has to be renewed every 1 year, I think. And so that asylum seeker status remains with that person until UNHCR processes the refugee status determination application, and then they become, if they are successful in the application, then they become recognized refugees. And because Sri Lanka does not have a policy of permanently hosting refugees, they also become entitled to, UNHCR gets them into this process of assisting them to see if they can be resettled in a third country. The problem with this whole process, even though it sounds very neat and perfect, is that it's not neat and perfect. Sometimes it takes several years. And till then, refugees and asylum seekers have to rely on the stipend, refugees have to rely on the stipend given by UNHCR. And families who are asylum seekers don't even have that support. So they rely on organizations, they rely on individual persons, they rely on churches, they rely on religious organizations to assist them through. And as you would have understood in Ruki's and Mayuran's presentation, it's a very, very messy, complicated, and lonely process. And recently I was watching a refugee drama where through this drama, they were trying to explain the mental situation, the psychological position or this thing, psychological status of refugees. And this person was explaining that we have come a long way, like we are traveling, we have come a long way, and we have reached land, but it still feels as if we had sea, because that is what most refugees and asylum seekers feel. They feel as if they're in a state of limbo. They feel as if they have not reached land. They feel as if they are in a state of continuous influx, because this is not a place where they can permanently settle. So there is a lot of biases and a lot of prejudices which are spoken about refugees and asylum seekers. One of the things which are often said about refugees and asylum seekers: they're coming here to take our jobs, they're coming here to take our resources, they are burdening our system. These prejudices are repeated over and over again, and repeated in the mainstream media, reported in public spaces, and even repeated in legal spaces when we talk about refugee cases and so on. So as Ruki was explaining, refugees in fact contribute to the Sri Lankan economy, often at the expense of being exploited, because they don't have a legal status to work here, and Sri Lanka doesn't have a policy for refugees and asylum seekers. So they're often exploited. We are benefiting from them in several ways. And children who are from refugee families are losing out on education. Many refugees and asylum seeker families go through several severe psychological conditions, because they are fleeing from persecution. They are fleeing from very, very violent conditions, but psychological assistance is not forthcoming. So they go through a lot of hardship here. So there's a lot of things which we can do to support refugee communities and asylum seeker communities. The fourth thing, the final thing which I want to touch on is my experience with dealing with certain cases when refugees and asylum seekers get entangled in our criminal justice process. So because they don't have a legal personality, or because they don't have not a legal personality per se, but because they don't have a status as such in Sri Lanka, their protection given under the criminal justice system is also, in my opinion, diminished. So for instance, in order to get bail, a person would have to have sureties, or a person would have to pay a certain amount of money, or a person would have to have sureties. Usually, those are the conditions in which bail is given. But even for a minor offense, sometimes a refugee or an asylum seeker might not be able to get bail, even though the court has granted bail, because they are often, they don't have relatives, or they don't have friends. They are like a isolated individual living in Sri Lanka. So there is no, even if they get bail, even if the court grants bail, they are unable to meet the bail conditions, so they remain in prison. But one of the things now, Ruki mentioned about, I think, a Court of Appeal case they filed, and the reasons why that case was dismissed. But one of the things I have noticed about lower courts, like for instance, magistrates court, at least in the cases which I have appeared in, is that magistrates are quite sensitive to the condition and the status of refugees and asylum seekers. So when we state these things in court, they are willing to listen, and they are willing to make certain make the law a little bit more flexible, not really bending the law, but make the law a little bit more flexible for refugees and asylum seekers. For instance, during the COVID time, when I did certain cases where where an asylum seeker found himself behind bars. The magistrate gave bail without sticking to the normal usual condition of sureties and so on, because obviously the asylum seeker would not have persons to give them to sign as sureties. And at the same time, I remember in 2013, there was a judge who 4 asylum seekers, 2 from Eritrea and 2 from Palestine, were arrested. And they had applied, they had written to the UNHCR, but they have not still gone through the whole process of refugee status determination process. And in quite an unprecedented move, the magistrate actually allowed the 4 asylum seekers to go to the UNHCR with security protection or whatever, go to the UNHCR to sit through this refugee status determination process and to allow them to and assisted them in the process. So in my experience, the magistrates court judges, I mean, of course, there can be other experiences. The magistrates judges have been quite sensitive to refugee cases and asylum seekers cases and so on. I don't know about the experiences in higher courts. So there are various varying degrees of experiences when it comes to the law and the refugees. But the main thing, the main issue is that irrespective of the fact that whether we have signed the refugee convention or not, we have, as Mayuran was explaining, we have produced large numbers of refugees, and other countries have been kind enough to host our people. When there was a war, when our country was exuding persons, other countries were kind enough to host these persons in their countries, and some of them are permanently settled in these countries. But we have not afforded the same courtesy, we have not afforded the same kindness to people who are fleeing from other countries due to war, due to persecution, and so on. And that is a huge gap in terms of we as a country, we as a country, and in terms of how we treat people who come needing our assistance and help. And maybe we can discuss this further on how to help, and maybe Ruki also will join into this. But just to give two examples of what happened in the past. In 2014, I believe, the government suddenly overnight decided to round up asylum seekers and deport them. Now, as I said, asylum seekers don't have the same kind of protection refugees have. Asylum seekers, the government sometimes have a tendency to round up asylum seekers and deport them without us being able to do much. So in 2014, I believe many asylum seekers were rounded up overnight by the military, by the authorities, and they were deported. And we were unable to do anything concretely to stop this deportation. And when I reached out to the media in order to report this sensitively or whatever, there was extreme insensitive reporting done by some mainstream media in terms of asylum seekers and in terms of how they are spreading diseases, how they're living in congested areas, and so on. At the same time, I believe in 2017, a group of Rohingyas who had obviously fled horrendous genocide persecution had landed in Sri Lanka, and then their residence was attacked by a group of Buddhist monks. And once again, there was a very divisive argument on social media where people were spreading biases against the Rohingya community, who have obviously fled violence, who have like serious violence. So one of the things people can do, even if they don't have the time to get directly engaged with refugee communities and so on, one of the things I feel people can do is when there is active bias being pushed on the refugee communities, or being the refugee community and the asylum seeker community are being portrayed as this in this very biased and negative manner, we as a country, and we as people who are discussing about this refugee situation, the challenges which refugees and asylum seekers face in this country, we have an active duty to counter this. So even if it means countering a social media post, and particularly to the people who are quite active on social media, whether it be Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, whatever, on social media, if you see a post spreading biases and false information and ignorant information about asylum seekers and refugee communities, I think we have an active duty to counter that. And people might think this is just a small thing. People might underplay the power of social media, but I think there is a role which social media can play in countering biases and these negative prejudices against refugees and asylum seekers community. I think maybe Mayuran and Ruki can speak further on this, but yeah.
Thank you, Swastika, for that presentation. So we'll open the floor for questions right now. I would like to invite all the panelists to Like if you have any specific questions you would like to pose to each other, please feel free to pose the questions. But to start off the Q&A session, I want to ask a very simple question, right? As young people, right, as youth, there are platforms, if you're really passionate about an issues pertaining to the peace building or reconciliation, there are platforms where you can reach out to and help out to, right? But how can young people help out in this time of crisis? And um, especially when it pertaining to the issues that are faced by refugees and internally displaced peoples, or even the asylum seekers who are reaching our shows. So what can young people do, and how can they take part in this uh, in this hostile environment, how they can constructively engage in this sphere? And I would like to direct this to all the panelists. So yeah. Ricky, do you want to have a go at it?
Okay, so my experience is that particularly after Easter Sunday, that there was a significant amount of interest among students and youth to learn more about the situation of refugees and asylum seekers, and also to actively support them in terms of humanitarian assistance, but also to challenge different myths and misconceptions about them. But of course, this is still a very, very small number. If you take the overall population of Sri Lanka and the student population or the youth population, people below 35 or like that, then it's still a very small number. So I think there's a lot more scope for more people to get involved. And I always felt that one of the most important thing is some direct interactions with refugees and asylum seekers will always has helped. So in many of the youth groups and student groups that I have worked with, many of them have wanted to go and visit and interact with refugees and asylum seekers. And that had led to, I think, more raising more awareness, challenging misconceptions and myths, and also providing practical assistance, sometimes like accompaniment, presence with them, but also sometimes financial material support that is quite crucial. So I think more kind of interaction with the refugee asylum seeker population would be a very important way. Of course, at the moment, it is very limited. Now, that is why I think even today, there was a group of students, law students that I talked to some months back. They have been wanting to go and meet, but then we couldn't arrange because of COVID. But today we finally decided that no, we cannot wait, and we arranged a kind of online meeting where we asked few asylum seekers and refugees to speak to them online. So I think that kind of interaction is very important. So I think more than what I say or what someone else says, that interaction will really motivate the young people.
Thank you, Ruki. There's a question from Rayan that is directed to Mayuran. Rayan is asking, recently the Tamil Nadu government, like there has been a government change and Tamil Nadu has concluded its elections, and he's asking whether what is the position of the current Tamil Nadu government on the matter of Sri Lankan refugees who are living in Tamil Nadu, or do you believe will there be a significant improvement to their plight? Mayuran?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for the question. Because for Tamil Nadu government and the political parties in Tamil Nadu, Sri Lankan refugees are kind of, are used as a kind of tools to attract the votes. No, they are used as used for vote bank politics. And even now, recently, 2 days before, the Tamil Nadu Chief Minister had a discussion with the Prime Minister, and they are raising the issue of providing citizenship to the Sri Lankan Tamil refugees in India as a resolution. But but again, the central government is rejecting on different grounds because of the geopolitical situation. India is sharing boundaries with many countries, and where they get the fleeing of many people coming inside. And even now Sri Lanka has hosted refugees from 13 countries, and therefore they made it clear to everyone that they are not in a position to provide citizenship for the people coming over there. But again, even there has been cases cases of people who have ancestors living in India before the 1947 partitioning, India before the independence of the country. That cases has been addressed, and for those people, Indian government has granted citizenship, but others, the Indian government, central government is clearly sending the signals that they would not consider them for the provision of citizenship.
Thank you, Myron. Thank you. And there's a question from Prahashini, and she's asking, has there been any action taken to provide job opportunities or promises for some of these refugees who are living in India? It's also a question directed at Myron. And how are they integrated into the working force in India?
Yeah, Indian government is providing opportunities for the refugees to do higher educations, because I would say that we have the figure that 4,000 of refugees have got the opportunities to undergo complete graduation. Had they been in Sri Lanka, I don't think they wouldn't have we wouldn't have that much of numbers to complete their graduation. But again, when it comes to the job opportunities are concerned, there has been a lot of restrictions. The refugees can't move around. They can't stay in urban places and work. So because of that restrictions, the refugees don't get opportunities to go around in the urban places and work for their livelihood. And for example, I will give you a case. Whenever the Tamil Nadu gets a visitor coming from the center, or a leader from other countries visiting Tamil Nadu, then there will be a camp checking in the refugee camp, and refugees are asked to be in the camp for head count, and therefore that kind of hindrances, that kind of restrictions doesn't allow refugees to freely move around and work.
Thank you, Myron. And there is a question to Swastika. What kind of what are the bottlenecks that are found in the legal system that that keeps denying the refugee rights? So it's very hard to expedite the process of addressing the real issues faced by some of these refugees, and how can we overcome them, especially if they lack legal representation or legal assistance? Swastika.
I think the main bottleneck is we don't have a policy, or not even a policy. We don't have any laws to recognize refugees, to recognize asylum seekers, to recognize that they are a special category of people. I mean, even if we don't have space, let's say that we have issues with resources or whatever, and even if we struggle to host refugees permanently, I don't think so, but let's even take it hypothetically. Even then, we should still have a policy on how do we welcome refugees, how do we what are the facilities which we can give refugees and asylum seekers. There is absolutely nothing, and the government has just pushed it on UNHCR, and UNHCR still has, I mean, they don't have a presence where they could churn out refugee status determination application at a rate. So before we even talk about bottlenecks, we have to recognize that our laws don't protect people who are fleeing from other countries. As Myron and Ruki also mentioned, we don't have laws protecting refugees and protecting asylum seekers. And this is very ironical, consider the fact that not many years ago, we were also sending refugees outside these countries. So that is the first step. If anyone wants to advocate for refugee rights or for asylum seekers, right, we have to push the government as a first step to come up with a policy on when a person, as a refugee person, comes into the country, or an asylum seeker comes into the, rather when a person claiming asylum status comes into the country, what is our government going to do? How are we going to recognize that person? How are we going to protect that person? That is the first step. The second step is, given the fact that the government is going to drag its foot, as it does in many other cases, there are many things which the judicial system can do. There are many things which lawyers can push for in courts. There are very creative arguments which lawyers can take in court. And the more people take up cases pertaining to refugees, unfair deportation, which happens on and off. unfair deportation, the more lawyers challenge it without falling into the mainstream narrative, the mainstream biases which are being pushed on the refugee community. And this exists quite strongly within the legal community when it comes to refugee rights and when it comes to asylum seekers, that they are coming here to take our jobs, it's not our business, we are a developing country, we don't have resources, that kind of narrative. So we as the legal community also can push against this bias and push against this narrative, and we can take creative arguments in courts. Even if, let's say, the judiciary is going to throw it out of the window, we can still take these arguments in court, which is not usually done. In my experience, what I have seen is people don't see the point. Lawyers don't see the point because they're like, okay, we don't have any laws to protect refugees, so why are we even bothering about it? But we need to push this. We need to push this window. In terms of bottleneck, in terms of why refugee status determination takes a very long time, I think that question can only be answered by UNHCR representatives. There are many reasons for that. There are international pressure which comes even after a person gets recognized as a refugee. The resettlement process to a third country takes a very long time because that country has to go through many different things like security check and different other checks, and they have to approve the resettlement process. So there are other issues also coming. So on our part as Sri Lankans, not really relying on a UN body, but what we can do inside the country, particularly people who are interested in the law, particularly people who are interested in the policy. The refugee community is a very small community who are currently in Sri Lanka. When Sri Lankan government takes a policy of deporting asylum seekers, like what happened in 2014, when refugee communities who are living in Sri Lanka are under attack, like what happened with the Rohingya community, and even afterwards, periodically this happens. We as a legal community and we as citizens can take an active stance against this and protect people. Even when the government was deporting asylum seekers, there were people who were protecting asylum seekers for them to remain in Sri Lanka so that they can go through the refugee status determination process. And technically speaking, what they were doing is resisting the government's policy of deporting asylum seekers. But in the large scheme of things, what they were actually doing is acting as doing their duty as humans, one human to the other, protecting a person who has fled from persecution. So there are people like that in Sri Lanka as well. There are people who defy policies and protect refugees and asylum seekers as well. So that is how I would answer the question, because we can't talk about a bottleneck in the legal system when we don't have a legal system and we don't have a policy to begin with to even talk about bottlenecks. Yeah.
Thank you, Swastika. And it also leads to the question I would like to pose to all the panelists, right? If you look at the Sri Lankan history, right, we have produced hundreds of thousands of refugees throughout, especially during the conflict years. But one of the time we often see is some of those who flee from Sri Lanka as refugees have, as finally mentioned by the panelists, have become citizens of those countries and got reintegrated into the system. But as we are talking about the social media narratives and mainstream narratives, oftentimes they are also demonized, and also they are like given very generic and politicized terms such as polarized diaspora, and oftentimes we Sri Lankans or the Sri Lankan population is not really willing to engage with them. So my question would be, how do we constructively engage with the diaspora community as we are trying to address some of these issues, right? How do we engage with them, and how do we constructively engage with them beyond the politicized narratives of polarizing diaspora with a separatist agenda? Because there is a huge vacuum that still exists in the system that can be tapped into, where some of the resources could be used to help some of the refugees who are being repatriated or who are reintegrated into the Sri Lankan lives. So that would be my question. How do we constructively engage the diaspora communities who left Sri Lanka once as refugees? So this could be answered by any of the panelists. Ruki, do you want to?
Yeah.
Go?
Okay.
Let Myron go first.
Okay, thank you. It's a very good question, because we should think of involving the diaspora into this process. But again, yeah, a lot more education and sensitization to be done, because Sri Lankan diaspora, I would say that currently nowadays, they are constructively engaged in different process. For example, the development, economical development and infrastructural development process in the northern and eastern province. But again, yeah, the government of Sri Lanka, should have some space or system to accommodate them in the policy making, planning, and also, the implementation of things. Because whenever we think of resources, we always think of the financial resources which we can get from different from outside. But again, they can also come in as kind of resource to share their capacities, and like in that way, by sharing the capacities, diaspora can be involved in the governmental planning and policy making space. I would think that would be an ideal to involve the diaspora in this process, because of course, the government of Sri Lanka should be ready to create that space for involving the diaspora in this process.
Ruki, do you want to answer that question?
Okay, so in my experience, I think the diasporas are polarized, and that is a fact. There are Tamil diasporas, which are predominantly only Tamil in ethnicity, and then there are a lot of differences among themselves. So then there are Sinhalese diasporas, and there are differences among them. And then there are a lot of groups, mixed groups that I have also engaged with in different countries overseas. I mean, I have attended discussions and meetings, events with several of these groups. So they are very polarized, and they also sometimes their way of, let's say, speaking, behaving, it also has a polarizing effect, even here in Sri Lanka. No? So I think we have to watch out for that also, and be generally be sensitive and cautious to that they might have a polarizing effect here. But something connecting to refugees is also, I think, some kind of a positive and a negative experience that I've had is that when I asked some refugees to help incoming refugees, so there has been mixed reactions. So some have gone out of their ways, like for example in Switzerland, in London, some people who had gone as refugees in the 90s or like that long time ago, now very well established, would come in a big car to pick you up and all that. Then when I asked them to support refugees who had gone much more recently from Sri Lanka, they have been very supportive. But then there have been others and groups in particular who spend, I think, thousands of euros or pounds for dinners and all that events. For causes in Sri Lanka, but who don't want to spend a few $10 or 10 euros for a winter jacket for a refugee who had gone from Sri Lanka, who is shivering in the cold in winter there, and to provide some translation assistance when they are trying to pursuing their refugee asylum applications in those countries and so forth. So I think help there, because there is still people who are not in very difficult situations in these countries who have gone from Sri Lanka, and people who are more established and who make a big racket and a big noise. Maybe we should start from there by supporting them, rather than making a big noise. So I mean, that's my initial thought. So I've had both positive and negative experiences, and positive experiences have also cut across ethnicity. For example, Tamil journalists that who had gone as refugees have helped Sinhala people who had gone as refugees like 5 years later or 6 years later, even though they were not very well settled. So that has also helped to cut across that barrier of ethnicity. So I think on one hand, I will be very cautious, recognize the limitations and the polarizations and the polarization effects of diaspora groups, but at the same time try to harness their potentials, particularly in terms of refugees who are already there and new refugees who are very vulnerable there.
Thank you, Ruki. And the final question for the evening will be, we have also spoken about, like, as we see the past 5 years, especially, there has been an upsurge in the narratives that are demonizing refugees, right? As finally pointed out by the panelists, right? They're coming to take our jobs. And we have seen that extensively with the Brexit campaign. We have seen that with Donald Trump's campaign demonizing refugees and especially immigrants who are fleeing the borders, right? And Harshana has asked the question, countries within the European Union and also USA are also recently avoiding refugees and immigrants. And also some countries brought to reduce the refugees entering their countries. What is the future for refugees, and how do we counter this ongoing upsurge of narratives against refugees and the increasing intolerance? And also, I would like to add one more question, add one more layer to this. Talking about Sri Lanka, as Swastika pointed this out, and we extensively hashtag generation also works on social media monitoring, and also trying to come up with constructive engagement plans to address some of these dangerous contents and also harmful speeches online. And one of the trends we have been seeing is a lot of these narratives against refugees and asylum seekers has also been peddled in the social media environment. So what do we do now, right? What's the next step? And if we are to produce counter narratives, can we rely on the traditional media alone? And if you are to produce counter narratives, what counter narratives would work? Ruki has already touched upon, like, creating real interactions with refugees. It helps others to understand the plight better. But what are the next steps we have to take is the question. And I'll pose it to all the panelists.
Can you hear me? Because I'm.
Yes, Swastika.
Yeah,
we can hear you.
I want to answer both the questions, because on the policies of Western countries not accepting, having not that they don't accept, they have an intolerant policy towards refugees. And there is also this thing of where particularly people from privileged backgrounds, because we can access other countries, Western countries, through the normal route, by applying for visa, by showing our bank accounts, whatever, and accessing other countries. It's not the same for many people, particularly people from less privileged background, particularly people who are, as I said, fleeing persecution and war. They don't have the luxury of showing bank accounts to obtain proper visas. So this narrative that countries are doing a great job to secure their borders, they have excellent border control, we need to spend more money on border control, Sri Lanka should learn from that. I don't believe in that. Of course, there has to be some kind of understanding who is coming into the country and out of the country and so on. But this excessive emphasis on border control and this excessive emphasis of keeping the foreigners out, keeping the unwelcome visitors out kind of narrative also feeds into why refugees feel unwelcome, persons who are claiming refugee status feel unwelcome and so on. We have to realize that when Western countries say foreigners are not welcome into the country, many years ago, centuries ago, the West came into our country without a visa or without a passport and colonized us. So now when the East is moving towards the West, all of these narrative is coming, and we are also falling into that. We are also falling into the narrative. We are also repeating the narrative which the West is, not only the West, but also Eastern countries, but also we are also supporting and amplifying the narrative which the West is creating. So that is on the question of this anti-immigrant, anti-refugee narrative which is being built up in the West, and we should actively counter it. That's on a larger policy level, larger political level thing. On this question of social media, as I said before, I don't believe that activism starts and ends in social media. And if an activism starts and ends in social media, I don't think it's very sustainable. So in order for us to counter social media biases and narrative which is coming through the social media, we need to know what we are talking about. So there are opportunities and spaces and events which organize like this event where people talk about refugee communities, where people who are actively involved in with refugee communities talk about events which take place, how we can get to know refugee communities and asylum seeker communities and actively counter our own ignorances and our biases. So I would say the first step is, if anyone is interested in countering these biases and narratives on social media, to read about refugees, to actively get to know refugee communities, particularly in Colombo and Negombo areas and all. It's not very hard to, I mean, I'm not saying go and harass and ask them for, just walk up to a refugee family and start asking for information. I'm not asking you to do that at all. I mean, that's harassment. Like, don't do that. But take an effort to get to know refugee communities and asylum seeker families in order to help us understand their issues further. But once you do that, then when you see posts and narratives and misleading information on social media, I believe we have to actively confront it. We have to actively oppose it. And it doesn't matter if that narrative is being put forward by your own friend, because usually social media also consists of a friend circle. You have to actively counter it and confront it, because that is the only way. I think this is a very slow process, but that is also the only way in which we can overcome bias and prejudices. And if you are only going to rely on mainstream media, this is never going to happen. So that is my answer to your second question.
Okay, maybe
Thank you,
I will
Swastika.
give
Sure. Okay.
some responses as well. I mean, in terms of what I said before, maybe I will elaborate in terms of interactions with asylum seekers and refugees. I think it can start in very small ways, but it has to be, I think, interaction based, and that is when I think the real kind of even a conversion can happen. So in 2000, I think there were three particular so-called crisis moments. In 2014, when many people were kind of deported, arrested, detained, and then deported. Then 2017, when in Mount Lavinia, some Rohingya community members were where they were staying were attacked, and they were forced to be displaced again from there. And then 2019, post-Easter Sunday attacks. And out of that, I think the post-Easter Sunday attacks was a fairly successful in kind of changing the narrative a little bit, whereas in 2014 and 17, I don't think it happened. So I think in that also happened because of interactions. Actually, journalists actually went there. So from mainstream media as well as alternative media, web media, they actually went there. Even students, artists, they all went there. Even lawyers who had not worked with refugees before, but who were very sympathetic and supportive, went there and talked to them. And then that led to taking up cases. So I think that awareness is going to be created, yes, through events like this, by reading some things. I also write about refugees, but primarily it is through interaction that awareness happens. And I think that change of that ideological shift or change of values and attitudes will happen more strongly through actual interactions. And they are the refugees and asylum seekers themselves are very strong advocates of changing minds and hearts, I think. So I think that should be explored more, maybe with the limitations of COVID right now, but then in the future, it can be explored. But also I think there are others who need to be aware, like media, for example. So mostly mainstream media journalists were also not aware of many facts about the numbers of refugees and asylum seekers. The reasons they come here is also very important, to know about who is the Ahmadiyya community, who are the Christians in Pakistan, what is their general situation, what is the situation of gay people in Pakistan or in Yemen or like that. So, and what leads them to come? I think those reasons are also quite important to know, that these people are not coming here to just to enjoy themselves and have a holiday or to make more money. So I think that kind of a knowledge is important. And even I think even the judiciary, I had bad experience. Even a magistrate in a particular magistrate even didn't know to recognize the asylum certificate. No, even the police didn't know. So there has to be even more awareness about police and magistrates even to recognize an asylum certificate. So, but when it went to an appeal and after many months of detention, both the police and the magistrate kind of accepted that they are legitimate to stay here with an asylum certificate. So even at that level, I think that kind of awareness raising will have to happen. In terms of challenging the myths, I think maybe it would be good if your #generation can undertake a bit of a study about what kind of perceptions are there now in 2021 in terms of asylum seekers and refugees in Sri Lanka. And I would think it's important to go beyond social media, particularly as a person who reads Sinhalese newspapers, watches TV news on Sinhalese. I think that is also important. Often, I think there is a lot of attention paid in terms of looking at hate speech, provocative speech in social media, but less in terms of media, particularly Sinhalese media, traditional media. But I think both have to be covered, and it will be good if a group like hashtag generation can have a look at the perception, so we can get a more objective idea of what is the situation. Because my personal feeling is that without any kind of evidence is that it is not so bad right now. It's certainly not as bad as 2014 and 17 in terms of negative perceptions about refugees and asylum seekers. But it will be good to do a study to find out the actual perceptions that are there. And then I think the last thing is, I think I would say is, thank you for organizing this. And I think more things like this are important, and particularly with the youth. So I hope that some of the youth who participate in this, at least a few of them, would become involved in supporting refugees in some forms, or willing to interact with them. Thank you.
With that, we are coming to a close for the panel discussion. And the fundamental reason we wanted to organize this panel discussion was to elicit this understanding, and also to provide any youth who are working out there an understanding about what this refugee crisis, and also how Sri Lanka is at a crossroads of this particular crisis, and how we can help in our own limited ways possible. I would really like to thank all three panelists for coming on board today. Thank you, Mr. Mayuran Anthony, Ruki Fernando, and Swastika Arulingam for coming and sharing your experiences, and also sharing and educating us on this issue of the hour. And thank you very much, everyone who tuned in today on a Sunday afternoon with us, for asking your questions and for a thoughtful discussion. And we'll see you all soon. Thank you very much.